What makes writing for preschoolers especially difficult? Today, you'll listen to Jason Tammemagi, a creative producer and writer at Cartoon Saloon, with 25 years of experience in children's television, including shows like Fluffy Gardens, Ollie, and Planet Cosmo. He'll point out the differences between writing for animation and live action, share the secrets of successful storytelling in animation, and teach you the importance of understanding your target audience. And if you stick around until the end, Jason will share what it was like to write an episode of Star Wars Visions.
Hello, Jason. Welcome to Write for Animation. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
We first met at Pixelado, which is the biggest animation film festival here in Mexico. And then it's great chatting with you at Annecy. How was your Annecy experience?
I love Annecy. I love the location, the vibe. I love that it's a mix of business and creativity. I find that I get sucked into the more business end of things these days. I would love in some of the next few years just to do the festival end. That's the fun end. The industry is in a strange place, and I think that vibe was around the whole of Annecy, and I really felt that. I think we're going through a time of big change. So I think it started to feel that last year at Annecy. It was interesting. That's where I first really felt, okay, there's a change here, and I could feel the knock-on effect at this Annecy. That's been interesting to dig a little deeper into, to try and figure out what's going to happen with the industry, where that's going to go. But I always love Annecy. I always enjoy it. And I get to catch up with friends. I have so many friends in the industry. It's lovely.
It was great to catching up with you as well. How did you get into the industry? I think that's always a key question. Our audience will appreciate the answer.
Well, to give you a quick background, I've been doing this a long time, so I'll skip over a lot of stuff. I started as an animator in the pencil and paper days. The industry changed a lot very early on. From Toy Story came out and a lot of 2D animation died down. I became a director, directing commercials for a while, and then children's TV, and that was where I found something amazing. The idea that you could make kids smile. I directed my first show called Rhubarb and Custard 2. It was a follow-up to a much-loved UK cult classic called Rhubarb, and from there, directed more TV shows and also created my own shows, which got me into writing. It wasn't necessarily my intention to write my own shows, but it went that direction. I ended up directing a lot of TV, over 200 episodes of television. I think I stopped counting somewhere around 210 episodes. Have written probably around the same amount live action feature films. From there, became a studio owner for a while, a producer. I've been at a lot of things in between, a lot of touching on storyboarding, design, little things that weren't for me, but it was really valuable to experience. It's been a long and varied journey.
That gives you a lot of abilities to talk to teams as well. I imagine as a producer, you understand exactly what they're going through.
That's it. I understand every part of the process in animation, and a lot of it I have done myself. I have that kind of deeper understanding. I think that stands to me even when writing, because I know what people have to go through in order to get that to the screen. I'm aware of how that will translate to the screen. Ability to try different things, even if they didn't all stick, was really valuable. There are certain things that at the time I felt, oh my God, I'm not going to be a good storyboarder. And it's only years later that I know that had value. It's been a long journey and an interesting.
You have a lot of writers that they cannot draw. Their artistic skills are not necessarily ready to get in the studio as an artist. What actions do you think are best for an animation writer? Somebody that loves animation, wants to get into the industry.
Every path is different. My path was quite unique. There's several parts to that, and I think the first one is crucial, which is to write and to keep writing and try to get better at writing and learn as much as you can so that your writing samples get better and better. The next challenge is getting those samples in front of the right people, and that's really about networking, turning up to the events, meeting people, making as many contacts as you can. And sometimes it's those accidental meetings that lead to an opportunity, but it's important that you be there. Turn up to things. If you have a local animation event, go to it. Anywhere industry professionals are meeting, go and meet people. If you can afford to go to a festival, go to it. Building up those contacts and then saying to people, look, I'm a writer, can I send you some of my samples? That's the thing you've got to keep doing. And so much of it is about timing. There will be so many times where you want to send someone your samples and either they don't want to see them or they do, they'll take them, but they won't read them. And that's only because they don't need someone at that particular moment, because your samples aren't necessarily right for them or aren't good. But if you keep doing that and keep meeting people, then one day you'll go, can I show you my samples? And it'll be the day this producer or whoever goes, oh, I actually need a writer right now. Let me read these. That's thing. It's just being in the right place at the right time.
That's really great advice. And since you wrote a lot for preschool animation, and one of our WFA Animation Academy members, Anna, she's a great artist, she asked, how do you put yourself in the headspace of little kids when writing for them?
It's an area I love, and I've spent a lot of my career on preschool. My answer to that is that there is an extent to which you have to accept you can't. And you can't think like a preschooler. And I think a lot of us, when we try to remember back to what we were like in those days, we're seeing it through an adult lens, interpreting it in a different way. For me, my big piece of advice is get to know preschoolers and do the research and find out what you can about them. Try to put yourself in that headspace, but also accept the fact some of it's about observation and actually learning about preschoolers, learning about how they process information, how they vary across different ages, because a 2-year-old is completely different to a 4-year-old. There have been some good TV shows that are worth looking up, and basically anything where you see kids featured, like there was a great one in the UK called The Secret Life of 4-Year-Olds, and it was a documentary kind of observing kids and how they interacted with each other. Something like that is amazing for a preschool writer. Seeing kids in action, and you start to realize, oh, I see what's the dynamic here. Young kids, they're very smart, but they're not little adults, so they process things in very different ways. So a lot of it is really just doing the research, doing the work to figure it out. I think that would be the main thing, but they are fascinating. They're a fascinating audience, and it's wonderful writing for preschoolers.
I have 3 daughters, so sometimes the ideas come from them.
That's it. If you have kids, you get to see them in action and get to see them grow up. And I learned a lot from having kids, but I also know some really good preschool writers who've never had kids. So it's not something that you have to have. And if you've got like a nephew or a niece or a friend has a kid and you're hanging out in their house, it is something that you can learn from those kids. Just watching them play. It's just like seeing how they interact with their surroundings and how they process information.
And this year, I went to the panel. It was very interesting to hear the simplicity of their thought in terms of how they see the show, and a lot of inspiration from the authenticity from their own families. So one of my things that need to get into psychology and study personality. I think that's important, but real observation is more direct and here.
Every now and again, you find some gold in that research, and it's some really useful stuff. But observation and just getting to know kids. Also, one thing that's really good, I think a lot of us don't do it enough. Testing our stories with kids. Even if it's a script or you're just telling like an outline, tell it to a kid and see how they react. You'll very quickly find where they get bored. Their attention can just shift, or they'll just start poking at you and stuff, and you're not engaging. You can actually test your stuff out with kids.
That's a brilliant answer. I think that's very useful. I would love to switch to your most recent experience with Visions. I love the episode. I think it's my favorite. And now let's switch gears and think about like how can we share the basics of writing a short film.
The short started with Will Collins, who wrote Song of the Sea and Wolfwalkers, Paul Young, who directed the short, CEO of Cartoon Saloon, and myself, just talking out ideas. We had complete blank page at the start. There was no right or wrong way of approaching that. We just talked a lot about what we liked, about different ideas, and a lot of it was very vague. We didn't have anything fixed. I think one of the things that we did all find interesting was this idea of what if you lived in a Star Wars universe. So you lived in a world which had the Force, but you didn't know anything about Jedi, or you didn't know anything about the Force or Sith or anything. And I think we all found ourselves a little bit fascinated with that. But the first stage was really just open ideas, just exploring everything. One of the things we identified with a lot of the ideas early on was that they were too complicated, that they would require more than a short film. And I think that's sometimes the downfall of a lot of short films, is that they're trying to be too much. You really have to accept the fact that they're short. That is what they are. And we in particular wanted it to be a short film. I think we may have been the shortest one of Vision Season 2, partly because I don't have patience for long short films. We wanted to tell a neat story. So a lot of ideas we threw out early on because we knew they were too complicated. Now, the ideas that we went with, what happened was we had thrown out a huge amount of ideas, but one day I just basically woke up with the bones of the idea that would become the short film. It was based on the Cave of Evil from Empire Strikes Back, where Yoda sent Luke into this cave. He failed this test, and my idea at the time was, what if someone goes in to do one of those tests, but at the end we find out that it's actually a Sith Lord, not a Jedi, who has been training this person. And that was the pitch. That's really the whole short, and that still describes the whole short. And I think the fact that we were all able to grasp hold of it in such a short sentence, in a way, that told us we were onto a good thing. It's something that we could tell in a very short space of time. Now, as it is, I feel we did pack a lot into that short, but the core of that story is really simple. It's almost my biggest piece of advice, probably for most stories, regardless of length, but definitely for short films, is go for the simple idea. Telling a complex story in a short runtime is just so difficult.
Having almost a blank page is very daunting. I actually like a brief and I like limits. I like to know what I'm aiming for. That process of dealing with a blank page can be quite tricky. It's actually hard because it's hard to know where the idea for the short came from, but it was largely through talking a lot through ideas, what inspired us and what didn't, and I think that just eventually led to that one idea. It's actually very hard to know what it was that brought that idea, but I think just exploring and being open to everything, I think that's really important, being open to every idea, but also then not being precious about them, being okay with going, it sounds cool, but that's too long, or that's not going to be the right story. And I think you have to be a bit ruthless at a certain point. We just happened upon that story. We actually happened upon two stories. That one and another one Will had come up with, which was actually great as well. So we pitched both of them, but the one, Screecher's Reach, was the one that Lucasfilm went for. I think we could have pitched 10, we could have pitched 1. They were completely open to how we wanted to work, which was great. They were always really supportive of our process. They were great, I have to say. They were really encouraging and they let us work the way we like to work. They were helpful, they gave us notes, but it was always about making what we were doing better. Coming up with that process, it was partly just about finding that neat idea, that very simple idea that we could hang a story on. With that idea, it was basically, what if somebody goes to do that test in the Cave of Evil, but it's a Sith Lord? It gives you the ending. So we knew the ending. And it's great to go into an idea knowing the ending is great. It's like we always had that focus of that target. We know where this story is going. And lots of other stuff could change, but we knew where the story was going. And that was great.
And that's fantastic. Writing with the ending in mind is our second big advice to share. On a practical level, do you like to outline or do you go on to index cards? I know you draw as well. So how is your process in once you got this high concept idea within the world of Star Wars?
My process is largely about avoiding that blank page. There's nothing worse than a blank page. I never start with a blank page. The first thing is just to take lots of notes. Any silly ideas, I'll just take them down. And if something sticks, I will then take it to an outline stage and develop it as an outline. And so even the outline doesn't start with a blank page because it's starting with the note. If I expand out the outline, that's not a blank page either because I had the outline. When we go to script, I've usually got a treatment that then becomes the bones of my script. So at no point am I ever starting with that blank page, which for me is a safety net. I never have to face the blank page. That's my process. It's one part leads to another.
That resonates with me a lot. That's also what I do. I literally copy and paste the treatment into the screenwriting software and then start it on. And all of a sudden I can see page count and, I already have some pages. So not starting from scratch and then you add dialogue and you expand. And I think that's a great advice as well. So you have your idea, you wrote like a bunch of index cards or beats, then you start the outline. How long was the outline now for a short film?
I think our outline was probably about a page and a half. Working on Screecher's Reach, it was an incredibly collaborative process. So I was writing with Will Collins, and we also had a huge amount of input from Paul, who directed the short. So we actually worked very closely as a team, talking through the story. So we had so many conversations. Most of the writing process actually wasn't writing, it was talking about the characters and talking about the beats. For the very first outline, it's actually interesting because part of this is luck in a way of the story that you're telling, but I would say from about a quarter of that outline to the end was almost in the short. And it was actually only the opening. We tortured over the opening. There were so many different versions of that opening. It quickly became apparent what the challenge was. And we had this group of characters who, at the end of the short, we would split up. Now, the challenge there is how, in about 10 minutes, can you make people emotionally invested in a group of characters that they actually care that they split up at the end? That was our challenge. And we identified that challenge. The challenge, I think, of any story is about that emotional heart. And that was the emotional heart of our short. It was breaking up that group. And we wanted them to feel like a family so that it mattered to the audience and they felt the emotion. I think our biggest challenge was that we knew what the emotional heart was, but actually setting it up in a way that people would feel it.
mission accomplished because it gets you emotional in such a limited time. I love how you were able to use the concepts we already know about Star Wars. At the same time, if somebody is not familiar with all the subtext, that you can still understand everything and feel that separation. In animation, that's where it gets interesting, but because as you were mentioning, it's not just typing words on the page, it gets like all the visual exploration. How do you balance that? Once you get storyboards and writing pages, do you wait until you have a full script to hand it out to story artists? Or how is your process in general?
The process in Cartoon Saloon varies a lot. For this short, we really worked that script before going to visuals. We worked it and we worked it and we got it really polished. And I think in this short, that was the right approach. And what really worked for us on that was that we all felt very solid about the story when it went to the visual exploration. So the visuals were all about how to tell that in the best way possible. They weren't about fixing story problems. They weren't about patching holes that we had left in the script. But they were actually just about how to tell that story in the best way possible. I think the visual artists on that short were incredible. And they were able to just take that story, which was actually quite simple, and elevate it with the visuals to create this beautiful piece of art out of our word. I'm glad we really worked at the story for so long. The amount we interrogated each line, because it was only 10 minutes. So we actually really spent so much time on every line to see was it getting as much across as possible. And most of that actually survived to the end short. There were a couple of sequences that got cut, but mostly that script remained intact.
It's especially at big studios when it's like the top studios doing feature films. Sometimes I hear them wishing to get a more polished script before. And on the other hand, you have that freedom and so much comes in from story artists or ideas, gags, moments, emotions, because you open up the process. How do you find yourself being more attracted in between these two projects?
Both of these approaches have a huge amount of value, but I think for me personally, I find it much more economical to get things right on the page rather than trying to work through them in animatic. However, I get really inspired by the visuals, and I also think it's really important when writing for animation not to let the script be a barrier to the visuals. What you're doing when you're writing a script for animation is you're providing the foundation and the scaffolding for the story that it will become. But it's a visual story. It is about the animation. It is about the art. So you have to allow enough freedom and enough movement in that story that visual artists can then take it and turn it into something particularly special. And there are moments and expressions in the short that were never on the page. They came from the visual artists, they came from storyboarders, they came from Paul, they came from individual animators, they came from effects artists, and each one was able to build on the script. So I think it's really important that the script doesn't become a limit. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it can be very limiting. And I think that's really important for animation. When you're writing for animation, don't let the script be a box that prevents people from turning it into something beautiful.
Do you remember any of those big moments that maybe got your attention when you saw the final or through the process that was not in the script?
The big one, I think, for me is when we cut to the campfire in the short. It's in the first part of the short, and Bathan is telling the story, and we get the ghost coming up in the trees. That was purely a visual thing that wasn't in the script. What I love about something like that, and it's funny because when I first saw it, I was like, I don't know about that. It's different to how I imagined it. But the great thing about that is it breaks out of the limit of live action. That is specifically a moment for animation. And that's what's beautiful about it. That's something you can do in animation that brings something unique to it. And that's important. If you're going to make something in animation, then use it. Use the medium and allow it to be free.
A test question could be, if this could be done in live action, why are you doing it in animation? And so it pushes you to explore more visually and the plasticity, that the fact that you can deform and move and get into emotions. I think that's good advice as well.
That's why I love Cartoon Saloon work. I love Song of the Sea. I love The Breadwinner. I love Wolfwalkers. And it's because those films, even ones that have grounded moments, they really use the craft. They wouldn't be the same if they were made in live action or even in another medium of animation. What I love is that the storytelling and the visuals really are hand in hand. And that's actually kind of rare. And sometimes it's positive for the story. It could be told in a lot of different mediums and still work, still be entertaining. What I love about Cartoon Saloon films, and I joined them as a fan, is that craft and their storytelling are one, and I love that. What's good as well as a writer is also to realize that you are part of a collaborative process. You don't have to know all of those visual tricks. You don't necessarily have to have that sense of what it's going to look like at the end if your story is strong. Recently, I was working on a film in Cartoon Saloon. It's a new one in development. I was fixing up the story and I was working with one of the co-directors. And while we talked, I was writing stuff and he was drawing. And when I saw what he was drawing, I just knew I can write quite minimal because I know what he's going to bring to it. I know he's the one who will come out and make it beautiful. I didn't have to make it beautiful on the page. I just had to make the story work.
That's one of the greatest experiences of writing for animation. I also noticed that difference when you start out, you're putting together your samples as a writer and with a focus on animation. You start working with others, like you just mentioned. Then you realize that there's a totally different way of doing things and the speed where you can get to solutions because you're no longer by yourself staring at the blank page. What are some tips you could give to somebody that could see and say, I would love to have a team, but for now it's me, my computer, and the blank page. And how can you get some of that experience when you're starting out?
That's a tough question because there is a team dynamic that is hard to replicate on your own. I think there's probably two things. One is to really study what you're trying to write for. If we are talking about a particular audience, while you're writing, try to consider that audience and that end product, because I think through that you'll think about the processes along the way. For example, we were talking about Preschool and we were talking about Bluey. Bluey's a great show. I find some new writers, I've been getting kind of sample spec Bluey script.
I'm working on one.
And it's great because what's nice about that is people who do that, they love the show and they know what it looks like at the end. So in a way, it automatically focuses them on the processes that will go to that end product. They may not necessarily know all the details of that process. It doesn't matter. But it keeps them focused on, this is what it looks like on the page, but I can imagine what it's going to look like at the end. So I think that's one thing, is having an idea of that end product. The other thing I would say is show your work to people, ideally in the industry, people you trust, people you want an opinion from. Because I think one of the huge things, and I got to admit this was tough for me to learn, is that you will be getting a lot of notes, you will be getting a lot of feedback, and learning how to take feedback is a skill in itself. And it's not an easy skill to build up. It involves a lot of skills. Firstly, it involves not getting too hurt if people give you some pretty terrible notes, but also then about what to take and what not to take, because sometimes taking on all the notes is not the right call. Sometimes there are notes that are trying to turn your story into the wrong thing. Even if you're a brand new writer, even if I'm not there yet, my scripts are terrible, start showing them to people, because in the act of showing and talking to people about them, firstly, you will learn about how to make your writing better, but you will also learn a huge amount about how you fit in a collaborative process. And I think that's really valuable. I think sharing your work and talking to other writers or other people in the industry is really valuable.
One aspect that I think is very interesting about your career is how you're more a producer. Even just starting by what is a producer in the animation industry, which is different from live action, and what are the different kinds of producers. Can you help us understand the definition of the role?
Sure. A producer is actually very hard to define sometimes because, as you say, there's so many different types of producer. There's a line producer who's very much about the workings and the systems of things. There are producers who are very much about just assembling the finances. And then there's producers like me, and I'm very much a creative producer. Being a producer in all of those types is about having that bigger picture view. It's about stepping back a bit, and it's about helping that process. I see it as a support role. For me, when I'm a creative producer, I am supporting the creatives, I'm supporting the writers, I'm supporting the director. It's about making their lives a bit easier, but also being able to step in if I see a problem coming that they haven't seen yet. A lot of it is just about having that bigger picture view and just almost keeping an eye on everything, but letting people do their job really well, getting the right people in the right place and letting them do their thing really well. It's in a way a hard job to define on a kind of daily basis. Often what I do is I assess creative work like scripts or even visuals, give advice on those, or I just say, carry on, this is going great. Or I give a lot of story notes. I've been a script editor as well as part of my career, so that carries into being a creative producer as well. But then going to the markets and pitching and being part of actually putting together the financing as well. It's a wide role, hard to pin down sometimes, and some weeks my job is completely different to other weeks. But it's a really interesting role. There's always something different.
What should a writer focus on? A set of skills to start expanding their knowledge and goals to become a producer as well.
There's a lot of different paths in that. One of the interesting ways through it is actually helping other writers, because that kind of takes you more into the script editing territory, but also about working with creative teams, which can be very useful. It's funny because I was a bad writer when I started. How I became a better writer was actually through the help of a really good script editor. Through notes, I became a better and better writer. So when I then later became a script editor, I was able to step away from my own work and actually have a bit more of an objective view, which is really important as a producer as well. But I was able to help other people with their scripts by being a bit more objective and using what I had learned. That is the same skill in a lot of ways as being a producer. What you need as a producer on top of that then is real knowledge of the industry. Learning about the industry, attending the markets, reading websites, and getting a sense of what's going on. I think that's really important for a producer. Some of expanding out into a producer is really about taking an interest in the bigger picture of what else is there and what's going on in the market and where might I fit in this. The one thing that is hard to give advice on is how to make that leap, because I think the path is so different for everyone. I don't think there's one way to become a producer. That's a very difficult thing to advise on, but I think a broad knowledge of the industry and learning in a way how to help others, I think is really important. A good story brain is really valuable. It really is, and having that, building up that writing experience and expanding out those skills, I think is great, because ultimately everything we do comes down to story. That's where writers are just at the heart of this. And if you're a writer and something else, then that's your kind of way to be a producer in a way. It's really when you just expand out those skills. And my path was particularly crazy, but it was in building up those different skills that gave me the producer role. It was the fact that I had a bit of different things, as well as having been a writer. Expanding out those skills.
This is fantastic. It's one of the best interviews because you went so deep and practical about things, which I really appreciate. The what to write and what to focus on. Sometimes people get lost because they read screenwriting books that sometimes they confuse more than there are some great books out there, but sometimes they put you into this idea of paint by the numbers.
I really struggled with that early on when I was writing, because what I found was I read so many screenwriting books and they have really great information, but I felt like I knew how to do it. But actually doing it on the page was a whole different thing. So I had the knowledge, but I didn't know how to apply it. And I think that was actually really tough for me. It's not just writing, it's writing and then actively learning. Because there is that thing of practice makes perfect. And someone once said to me, well, how does that explain taxi drivers? Writing and making the same mistakes over and over again isn't necessarily going to help you. But writing, then putting something down, leaving it for a month, and then coming back to it and going, okay, if I was just reading this and I didn't know I had written it, how would I feel about it? And being really honest with yourself and actually trying to learn from that. I got a lot from doing that. And eventually the stuff that I learned from the books started to click, but I needed that experience of just writing and writing before the stuff in the books actually really had an effect, if that made sense. So there's a difference between knowing all the theory and being able to apply it. The other thing about the screenwriting books for me was they were a great way of not writing, a great way of just procrastinating, going, I'm learning how to write. And that actually was a way of just not forcing myself to sit down and write.
That's true. Like reading about how to swim. It's about how to swim. You need to get into the water. Don't even watch these videos if you haven't written that day. Start and take 10 minutes a day, but write first and then consume later. Don't watch a movie for reference if you haven't written that day. Sit down and write. Because I was guilty for many years of this, like super expert about what the book said and not writing. And that's great advice.
Another part of that with the books is to keep in mind that these are tools. They're tools. They're not rules. The big test of a script is if when someone's reading it, they're enjoying it and they're turning the page and they want to know what happens next. It's not whether a particular thing happens on page 12 and another thing happens on page 36. That's not what's important. Those are important if someone's reading it and they're bored. Then you look at the toolkit and go, okay, what have I done wrong here? What's not working in the structure? Really, your first goal is just to entertain. The stuff you read in the books shouldn't be a shackle. It's important to know them, but they're tools. They're good for troubleshooting. They're good for helping you. Or for me, sometimes about avoiding that blank page. If I have a kind of sense of structure, that's already a scaffolding that I know, okay, at least I've got that safety net. If this story, I've already got a target for my story, and that's great. It's almost like we need to establish as writers this healthy relationship with the screenwriting books and the tips we hear. We've got to take what works for us and be open to learning it, but not letting it rule us.
Especially some specific books that are very to the point. I think Save the Cat is a great book when you you've done it for a while and you understand why he was able to synthesize it. But if you read it at the first book, that's probably one of the worst things that you can do as a writer, because you get this false impression.
Save the Cat is like one of the best and worst things to happen to Hollywood movies. It is fantastic. It is great, full of insight, but it has been taken as a template that must be adhered to or your script is wrong. And that's a problem. I remember quite a few years ago, a couple of decades ago, there was an Irish film that did particularly well. I think it was called Adam and Paul. I think I'm attributing the story to the right people, but we have a local Film Ireland magazine, and they told a story about how they applied to the Irish Film Board for funding, and the Irish Film Board told them that going into Act 3 was weak. Their answer was, we don't have an Act 3. We just wrote. We don't know that there's an Act 3 there. And it was a really good movie, but they didn't have to have a particular thing happen on a particular page.
Sometimes producers come from maybe the financial aspect, and that they read that, and it also makes it seem super easy. You just follow that you have a story.
It's not that easy. It's not.
But now on the positive side, what are some things that are positive from the Cosmo structure without being a specific book, but that allows you to communicate with the team and also not having a blank page?
That is the big one for me, is not having a blank page. And I'm not too rigid on the structure, but at least I know certain things I might be aiming for. I sometimes pick and choose what I like in a kind of established structure, and that gives me a little bit of a target. But then I think they become a very useful troubleshooting tool, in the sense that if I find that it just doesn't feel like there's enough drama towards the end or something is missing, then I'll go back to the structure and I'll look at, okay, what are people expecting here? If this was a standard structure, what are people expecting? And maybe my story doesn't need a low point. If something isn't feeling right, then I'll go, what happens if I make this the lowest point? And I really push that as far as I can go. Now does it feel better? And so it becomes a tool. I can compare the structure with what I've got and see, do these tools actually help me make it better? Often there's some really good stuff in that structure, but for me, it's often when I'm identifying a problem. If something is a little weaker or just is a bit not as engaging as it should be, I find sometimes going back to those structure tips can really help.
Finding the right mix of structure and emotion is the kind of thing we talk about in the Write for Animation Academy. If you love storytelling and want to improve your skills, come join us at writeforanimation.com/academy. I cannot wait to meet you in our next session. Now let's hear about Jason's experience writing for Star Wars Visions.
Something that I think that it hasn't been talked enough in screenwriting books is the importance of theme. When in the interview with Tom Moore, he mentioned the painful truth, this idea of pain. I thought it was a beautiful way to express something that we all deal when we approach the narrative theme. What is your approach? How do you see theme?
The painful truth is interesting because that's a big thing for Will Collins, who wrote the short with me. Will is an amazing writer. He's just got a fantastic brain and he's wonderful to work with. We made a really good collaborative team and we're actually working again together on something. For me, theme is really important. It's interesting that so much of my work has been preschool, because for me, preschool is all about theme. What questions am I posing to children? What am I trying to get across? It's often not about the story. It's about what I want them to think about at the end of it. For example, this might sound like an odd approach, but in some of my preschool work, I wasn't telling stories for those children. I was telling stories for the adults that they would one day become. And I was trying to give them little pieces of knowledge, confidence, or about themselves that might carry on into adulthood. Those are the themes. Those are what those stories were about. The plot were just like the characters doing the things. That's what a story is about. So I'm really big into theme. Often a rich theme is complicated. It's not a simple question. Themes often exist in the gray areas, which is tricky for preschoolers because preschoolers are not great with gray areas, but themes definitely for stuff like Screecher's Reach. What I loved about the response to the short was that we brought people right into the gray areas and it worked. Left quite a lot of people unsettled at the end of the short because they were like, okay, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I don't quite like it, because it wasn't as obvious as, oh my God, this is terrible. And it definitely wasn't a happy ending. I love themes that are in the gray areas. I love those.
I loved your definition of the theme for preschool. It's a parenting lesson as well. What do you want to teach? And that sensation of the end, that's why I think it's so beautiful. That ending, heart-wrenching, and at the same time, it's the core of the entire Star Wars saga. And I couldn't say anything more than compliments because I think it really captured that final shot. It's so beautiful.
I think it's interesting as a writer, the difference between writing on your own compared with writing with someone else. One thing I found interesting early on in my career was that I wrote alone. That was my thing. I wrote alone. I did it myself. And I almost felt I had to in a way. Maybe it was confidence. It was that I felt like this was the thing I needed to do myself. Maybe I didn't feel comfortable enough with another person to write with them. And yet I saw some great writing teams and I always envied them. Having someone else to lean on must be great. But I wrote alone for most of my career. Don't really have any regrets of that. I learned a lot having to do it myself in a way and having nobody else to lean on except good script editors. I would always advise people getting a script editor because a script editor can really help you as a writer. Writing the Star Wars Vision short I wrote with Will Collins. He's an incredible writer. That experience was fantastic for both of us because what it did was we both came to that short with different strengths. We were different types of writers. Will works a different way to me. And I think there's probably some writing teams where that doesn't work, that instantly you know, okay, we're not going to be able to write together, this isn't going to work. But for Will and myself, we complemented each other amazingly well. And I think we got a better short because of it. Because one of the creative processes we had was that Will had come up with an idea and I had come up with an idea. When we went with Screecher's Reach, there was a moment where Will said, you should write it. And I was like, oh no, I'm not writing it without you. And so we wrote together. And I genuinely do not think that short would have been anywhere near as good as it was without both of us. The idea of exploring collaborations as a writer is definitely something that I think everyone should be open to. It may not always work. I think personality with the person you're writing with is going to be a huge factor. When it clicks, it can really elevate your writing. It's a really fun process.
I love when it's with a director because at some point it's their movie and it really helps settling when there's a disagreement on something. For me, it was like, that's okay, we are on different pages here. I want to understand your vision because you're the director. And most of the time, I end up understanding why that idea was actually better and super cool compared to writing alone.
That's really important to get as well, as knowing that the people on your team, and especially the director, they're your allies. They're your champions. They are the people who are going to make this great. Embracing them as collaborators is really important. It's so important. And leaning on a director and kind of hearing from them how they see it. And then that can really help inspire you. Or if you're going in a direction that they don't like, it's okay, why? What's not fitting here? And trying to understand that, I think, is really important. Sometimes it's important to be strong about your story, but it's not a good thing to try and be stubborn and force your views on a director. Listen, being a good listener is such a part of being a good writer.
Thank you so much, Jason. Of course, Cartoon Saloon has done more than Star Wars. Watch this video to learn how director Tom Moore wrote the amazing Wolf Walkers. I'm Pietro, this is WFA Animation, and I'll see you there.